All right. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Stoa. Thank you for being here. As a reminder, this is a community funded project. So if you enjoy listening, you can support us by sending some sats to the QR code on our website at bitcoinstoa.com, or you can boost us sats using Fountain. The Fountain app is a great podcast interface. You can also be paid Bitcoin to listen to podcasts using Fountain. Current Moscow time is 3706 at block 812352. And with that said, it's my honor to welcome Dan Ostermayer to the podcast for a conversation about his story as an ER doc who escaped the medical matrix. We're also going to talk about how he got into Bitcoin. We're going to talk about co-sleeping because Dan actually wrote a book about that. And so, Dan, welcome to the Bitcoin Stoa.
Yeah, it's a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So maybe because it's your first time on the podcast, why don't we start with your story? So maybe tell the people who you are, the work that you do, and a little bit about maybe what motivates you these days.
Yeah, that's a great. Thanks, thanks for the info. I'm an ER doc. I live down here in Houston with my family. In the United States, we go to medical school. We have a residency. I did my training out in Los Angeles at a county hospital down in southern Los Angeles, and I practice in the ER day in and day out, day in and we basically. We do all the normal stuff. It's just like it's a shift work kind of job. It's night shifts, weekends, holidays, sort of all the stuff that you never really want to encounter a doc for. But we're there when people probably need us the most, and it's a super gratifying position for the last 11 years I've been practicing medicine. As an attending. Prior to that, all the training, and it was awesome. And basically you just grinding along, studying, doing all the normal things that you hear about docs doing. Especially when I was in Los Angeles, just learning the ropes of how to be an independent practitioner in medicine. And then fast forward to up until today, and you mentioned sort of escaping the medical matrix. Along the way, we sort of had some slow sort of eye-opening moments to what we know about the modern healthcare system, what we know about sick care versus healthcare, because they're two distinct things. And then you had mentioned a little bit in the intro that had who've written a book about co-sleeping. That was probably my sort of red pilling moment to just sort of what the medical literature can tell people is truth and what we can tell people for certainty and what we can't. There's limits to human knowledge, and especially there's huge limitations to medical knowledge. And a lot of what we know about as medical knowledge is inexact science, and that's probably the nicest way to put it. In that, some of the things that we recommend, and for example, my sort of eye-opening moment was when we had our first kid, and it's a terrifying moment. And when you might have an MD after your name, but you're still no more prepared to take care of a growing human than anyone else, and perhaps even less prepared than someone who's raised many other children before, and mothers who've come before you. And so that was sort of my sort of bigger eye-opening moment about some limitations and some recommendations that the healthcare community has for raising a young kid and trying to deal with some of those challenges.
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks for that good intro. And I think when it comes to medicine, I think there are so many benefits to modern medicine. You don't want to throw everything out by saying, oh, the medical system is broken, because I think while, and I love the distinction you made too, because I completely agree that disease care or sick care is different than health care. And I think we need to acknowledge it as such. But I think in terms of sick care, emergency room medicine for emergencies, I'm very grateful that exists. If I ever have an emergency, I want there to be able to be docs available that I can go to reset the bone in my arm or take care of an acute emergency. And so I think that is one of the most powerful examples of the wonder of modern medicine. I think with the chronic stuff, that's where we kind of drop the ball, where we're so hyper focused almost on trying to get rid of the symptoms that we're presented with. We sort of lose sight of the fact that, well, the default state of humans is healthy. So why are we seeing so many things break down when the body is so good at being healthy? And so, yeah, I think, when it comes to, I've heard some MD friends of mine describe medicine as sometimes the golden handcuffs, where you go to school, you put in all this time learning and spending all this money to get a degree. And when you come out of school, you have a good salary, but that income and position can sometimes restrict the path in terms of what you're able to do and what you're able to say. And so when you talk about, bumping out of the matrix, how has your, I guess, experience been since you first became an MD till now? And, if there was an MD listening to this that feels really, really trapped in the current way of doing things and maybe wants to have a better way, or hear inspiring stories from docs who have found an alternative way in some way, shape, or form within the medical system, how has your journey been since you became a doc until now? How are you doing things differently? And what words of wisdom do you have for maybe a doc listening?
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it. So, when you say break out of the matrix, and I say that, and I sometimes talk to myself and friends about, how you can sort of free yourself, from the matrix. It's just a way of thinking. I still practice within the modern healthcare system. I'm still an ER doc. I, work within all the confines of modern medicine and all the, beauties like you mentioned. But when you go back to sort of the beginnings of physician training, in medical school, despite all of the criticisms that we may have of modern medicine, medical school training is really a first principles training, at least for the first 2 years. A lot of people will talk about you spend a lot of time memorizing tests and facts, but all of that is really, scientific, fit first principles. How does one particular receptor interact when it's triggered by an X pharmacologic, therapy? How does your body's physiology interact when it's exposed to a particular toxin? How does cholesterol get processed actually within the body? All those basic physiologic first principles are taught without really any prejudice. And that first principle thinking, although perhaps not tested in the most first principle way, and I think that maybe contributes a lot to why some of those first principles are forgotten, and the basic fundamental building blocks of human physiology and chemistry are perhaps forgotten, because it maybe is tested in a little bit of a regurgitative fashion where you're really just spitting back facts instead of processing some of the actual truths which have been discovered over hundreds of years, and lots of basic benchtop research methodology to figure out how our body actually works, and then gets put into practice, perhaps in a bastardized type way. Those first principles are taught to all docs. They all have them. They're all there. And there's just that the ability, or maybe the impetus, to continually ask why. Why does this work? And then
Hmm.
why do we know that this works this way, this particular receptor? Why do we know that humans behave this particular way when exposed to this particular stimulus? Or why do we know that the body reacts this way when exposed to this disease? And then asking why, that many layer time to finally get down to that first principle truth. That is there at the fundamental building blocks. And if there's a doc listening or anyone in the healthcare profession, irrespective of whether you have you're a doc or not, going back to those first principle truths, remembering how you were taught to read a scientific paper with a bit of skepticism, and understanding the limitations to scientific research, and how it can really only potentially show a negative and not prove a positive. That you can show that something is not there, but you can't know for sure that you have not, had a false, positive result. Those truths are all there inside all, scientifically trained, people. It's just perhaps that when you get into practice and you're, following a guideline, or you are expected to perform a particular way for a metric within your healthcare system, it becomes lost. But that knowledge was, should ideally still be inside almost all of us who have gone through any type of medical or scientific training.
Yeah, well said. And it's just a matter of, like you said, remembering to continue asking questions, and I guess, really reverting back to first principles and the things we know for sure to be true, and then building an understanding from there. I think it's sometimes easy to, um, and there's so much to know. This is I think the crux of it, where there's so much to know, there's so much to understand. It can sometimes be the easier path is to take the result of a research study as truth, because there's no way to have enough bandwidth to learn deeply about everything. But I think, like you said, it's almost like every research paper we read is sort of one piece of the puzzle and is not the whole truth in and of itself. And until you zoom out and really, like you said, take your first principles tool belt and apply it to that piece of data, you don't really want to treat that as gospel. You want to treat it as part of the puzzle. You're a Bitcoiner, and this is kind of how we connected. John Vallis and I did our first health hang.
Yeah, it was
You would
great.
listen to that, send me a message on X. It seems weird to say X.
Yeah.
I'm still like in Twitter mode. Um, And yeah, you just kind of mentioned that, you're open to having conversations about health. And so I'm going to chat to John. It might be good to get you on our next sort of health hang, depending on what the topic we're talking about is. But you're a Bitcoiner, and I'd love to hear your Bitcoin story. When did you get into Bitcoin? And what I'm always curious about specifically is how has understanding, learning about, living in alignment with Bitcoin affected the way that you work or the way you perceive the world? So, tell it in as long form or short form as you want, but how did you first get introduced to Bitcoin? What was that first touch point, if you remember it,
Mhm.
and sort of how has that journey gone until where you are today, and how has that affected, how you view the world? Because those are the answers I really love hearing about.
Yeah. So my story, so they're all gradual. It's, we, the phrase gradual and suddenly is also sort of, I think, an individual, story as well. Everyone has sort of those gradual exposures to it. And then suddenly there's a click. I can say that I remember, well, even before just learning about Bitcoin, I had some computer science background in undergraduate. I was always very interested in technology. I remember getting, first compact computer in the house and just going, wild with it and being so impressed and interested in being able to, whether it's, as a young kid, cheat on a Diablo game or reprogram, a small little basic script to try to do a particular thing to move the mouse away. And it was just incredible. So there was always an inkling of technological wonder that I've had since being a young little kid, and being able to tinker with, things, tools and computers in the house. But so besides for just having a fascination with technology, there's also, and it's very difficult to know where this came from, but perhaps it originates with your parents. A lot of ideas, sort of this idea of peer-to-peer trade. I remember my parents, or at least my mom, always being involved with craft fairs and farmers markets, and that sort of perhaps imbued a sort of very subtle subconscious understanding that trade between individuals is always on a small scale, even though it often gets abstracted away in a much larger scale with businesses. But when I was an undergraduate, I had this, it's a really interesting idea. It's probably building upon this peer-to-peer idea that in undergraduate you're always buying textbooks. There's probably a much cheaper and easier way of not having to do the hamster race of upgrading $100 per semester to the new book. Why not trade amongst universities? So I had actually programmed with it with some help of some other friends at university, a small little book trading site, just so that we could just bypass the bookstore. There's no reason to not just swap books, especially if the edition is still the same as the one prior. And it caught on a little bit and it was fun, but it fizzled ultimately, and it had built upon some of the Facebook marketplace graphs that were available at the time when Facebook was actually first starting to roll out to universities. And so that sort of got in my mind, again, probably subconsciously, and it was forgotten about for a while, the fact that things ultimately on the internet are peer to peer, and that was really exciting to me. Whether it was BitTorrent or Shazam or Kazaa, and a lot of these file sharing,
I haven't heard those names
Napster
in
back
so
in the
long,
day.
but I remember them.
Yeah, and so that was really big when I was in university, Napster, and trying to port forward through firewalls at universities and try to share your music collection. Even the simplest of having your iTunes directory exposed on the network so everyone could stream from their iTunes client on their computer your playlists. And that just built upon my fascination with just peer-to-peer technology, and how fun it is to share things, and that information ultimately always wants to be free. And knowing that, seeing how long torrent sites and BitTorrent clients have essentially been impossible to ever stop, even though the torrents go offline. You've got the DHT links to keep them going, and that these files essentially live on forever as long as one or two clients still have them and are peering. And then fast forward, I was in residency, dirt poor, working, long hours. And I remember reading a Slashdot article about Bitcoin. I thought it was interesting. I sort of wrote it off. But somewhere along the line, I heard another story about it, and I had seen it in a chat room that I was a part of. And just wired some money to Mount Gox. I only had a few $100s anyway, so why not try to see what this is. And sure enough, Bitcoin shows up. You got to fire up an Electrum wallet. At the time, it was sort of what I used. I wasn't running a full node, and it was just incredibly fascinating that you could just send something that seemingly had value, even though it was only $100 or so at the time, back and forth between individuals. And then it went up in value and I sold it and I could buy a surfboard because I lived down in Long Beach, and I thought it was great and I thought I was a genius. And then I just promptly forgot about it. Then fast forward and you hear about it again and again. You hear about the Silk Road, and there's this multi-touch point, just exposure to the fact that this thing continues to live. And I think at that point I connected it, to the concept of BitTorrent, where if there's always one peer or one seed, then the forest can be regrown. And that idea, really flourished in my mind about how this was maybe not necessarily the monetary revolution at the time, because I didn't have, had not gone down the monetary rabbit hole, but was at very least an incredible piece of technology that at the very least allowed small scale commerce. I thought, oh, this would be awesome for farmers markets. Thinking about my mom selling baskets at a farmers market, you just tap one phone together with another and instantly you exchange a Bitcoin's worth of value. And at the time, in 2011, 2012, that just was amazing. And I just sort of put it in the back burner, put the seed phrase away, and just forgot about it. And then as I heard about it more and more, and started, whether listening to podcasts or also listening, reading, just various articles on it, revisiting the white paper and just reading it one time when I had a free weekend because I was, fascinated by it. It just began to click as something that essentially was unstoppable. And that sort of unstoppable tech is really, it's just really inspiring because it's essentially like a constant. That the same BitTorrent clients that worked back in the day, still those BitTorrent clients work now. Whereas I remember distinctly various file sharing clients disappearing because they have a company behind them or they were sued out of existence. Whereas things that were built on protocols like Nutella protocol, they still exist and they still function well. And I think that sort of college environment that I had been in, plus the multi-exposure technological descriptions that I had read, slowly just solidified it as something legitimate. And then after that, much of the monetary discussions have come through Michael Saylor's work and many of the books, the Bitcoin Standard. Those books just embellish the technological brilliance in sort of the social layer, which is I think the monetary layer, because it's just a piece, it's just tech, but it's that's sort of ungovernable, immutable, and protocolized piece of tech that is beyond us and that will live just like any type of open source operating system well beyond the corporation that stops supporting it. And that is really inspiring because you can see it throughout all of computer history, is that all a protocol has to do is just exist, and it has to exist and have some sort of interest, and then it never goes away. You can see how long BSD has existed within the the academic environment as Unix, and then now ultimately in most of the tech world as Linux. You can see how all the internet protocols have just continued to exist, and you can see how a lot of proprietary tech, whether it was the proprietary VHS standard, all the proprietary HD DVD standards, they all go away over time because they lose the support. But when something is essentially without without a corporate backer that's needed, it can just exist, and all it needs is time, and usefulness will always be on its side. And that was, I think, from the tech standpoint, what really got me. And then you start going down the monetary rabbit hole, and you learn about how how it is a potential solution to so many at least societal problems that we see ourselves in.
Wow. That was a great explanation. Is that the first time you've told it on a podcast, the story?
Yeah. So I mean, to be honest with you, I think this is probably one of the first podcasts I've ever done. I don't,
Cool.
I'm just a dad and a doc. I don't do a lot of, I have nothing to promote.
I think you got a lot to share. I don't have anything to promote. I do these selfishly because I want to talk to people like you that I would never otherwise have a chance to talk to, right? We're in different countries, different ecospheres in terms of work. And I think it's just a really beautiful thing that even though we use the platform of Twitter/X to connect, just the notion that you can talk to someone somewhere completely different, find common ground, and actually appreciate just hearing stories of how everyone comes to this destination of being what we call, a Bitcoiner. The other day, I was even talking to my wife saying like, I'm excited for the time where saying you're a Bitcoiner is as silly as saying you're an interneter. It's like, you don't say that anymore because everyone uses the internet. And
Yeah.
I really think that, the people who call themselves Bitcoiners are almost going to be the OGs in the grand scheme of things, to where, my daughter won't say she's a Bitcoiner. She'll just be like, well, duh, dad, I use the money that everyone uses. Um, but I love how the soil that allowed sort of the seed of Bitcoin to germinate after a couple touch points was the unstoppability of file sharing and protocols. And it really does seem like we're in kind of this transition point, not only in the monetary system, but also moving away from platforms, which are showing their susceptibility to censorship and all the negatives that are associated with a company running a server that you need permission from to post something or say something. This transition from platforms to protocols, which are unstoppable, which actually have this accretive effect where everyone building on a protocol actually creates more value for that protocol for everyone using it, including all the other companies. So whereas the proprietary tech in Facebook's platform, if they build something cool, they don't benefit anyone else in the ecosystem except for them, which is their incentive, I suppose, capitalistic wise, to make money off of what they're doing. But I think there's this really cool feature with protocols where someone that builds a really cool Nostr client or Bitcoin client, Bitcoin wallet, can actually inspire a lot of cool ideas for someone else who builds one. And they're allies more than competitors. Sure, they're competitors, but if you look at this new world that's blossoming as an unending amount of people that are going to be coming into it, it's like we need all the clients we can get. And actually, the free market is really the best arbiter of who's going to win, and the best experience ends up winning. And that benefits everyone from the companies to the users. Whereas the client server architecture of platforms, it's like it doesn't really have this same holistic benefit that a protocol has. So yeah, very cool that you came at it from that perspective. And it really is sort of this Bitcoin, sort of this ephemeral blob that just kind of chips away at all of what you previously thought or understood, and just sort of gradually, or at least I found in my experience, tears everything I formerly thought I knew down and allows me to rebuild from, like you said, first principles, from this standpoint of being able to feel empowered that I can verify truth. And actually, if I store my time in a tool that doesn't steal my time, I have time to look into all these things and actually learn about the world in a way I never thought relevant before.
Yeah, and I mean,
So
that is just how humans have worked forever. I mean, we call it a
yeah,
protocol because that's the computer science term for it, but it's just it's a useful idea. I mean, just like the
just like
first
English.
ape that discovered, the ability to use a stick to get ants out of a log. I mean, and then everyone else mimicked that useful tool. I mean, it is just a useful idea put into practice with an ecosystem that is free around it, and that is essentially what a protocol is. English languages are protocols. The scientific method is a protocol. I mean, these are
Yeah.
just ideas with a useful framework, and we've done this since the beginning of time, since we emerged from the jungle.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
this is just the newest tech uh,
exactly right. Yeah.
that when you're in it, it doesn't, it seems slow when you're in it, but when you really zoom out, it's like technology is speeding forward at light speed with each technological innovation. And yeah, it's like sometimes easy to forget how fast we're actually moving when you look at the zoomed out timeline of humanity. Um, and it seems like every new tech iteration is actually like an order of magnitude more empowering and more accessible, especially now that we all have access to internet connected devices. So yeah, very exciting time. Um, One thing I wanted to ask you was, I have my own standpoint of how Bitcoin is going to change health and disease care, like that whole area of the world, sick care, disease care, health care, just the space of health, everything from individuals taking care of themselves all the way to individuals seeking help when they get ill. Any thoughts to share on
Yeah.
how Bitcoin and this unstoppable monetary protocol is going to impact the world of health, and maybe even more specifically, because that's a really general one, is like, what are you most excited about in terms of how Bitcoin has the potential to positively impact human health?
Yeah. I'm not sure Bitcoin. I mean, so Bitcoin probably won't impact health. Well, I think the better way of saying it is that I think the biggest problem that allows for us to have sort of healthcare and disease care sort of mixed in the same bucket is the fact that most people have very little sort of skin in the game in terms of the cost of their decisions for acquiring a disease. So we see, you mentioned, many chronic diseases are as a result of various life choices, whether intentional or unintentional, and beyond, the genetically, linked, chronic diseases. But many of the chronic healthcare problems, diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, um, many of the adverse events that result from those, heart attacks, strokes, vascular problems, all of those are as a result of there being a sort of a very easy path to have those diseases well funded through a lot of the sort of insurance entities that we use. So, not to say that most of those diseases are not real problems. They certainly are. And most of them probably have very easy solutions, although very difficult for individuals to implement, much of which are sort of lifestyle changes. And
Mm.
we have many small medications along the way that can hopefully ameliorate them before they cause serious problems. But the ease of getting care for those and the sort of the cheapness of which that care appears to be is often as a result of the way that we interact with healthcare. We pay through it. We pay for the the problems and this quote unquote solutions to those problems indirectly. And so the cost of having to continuously go to a physician because you have XY or chronic disease is abstracted away, because the cost of your insurance is also abstracted away, and the payment for that service is abstracted away to the insurer. And so there's no real direct relationship, going back to our peer-to-peer conversation, between the doc accepting and charging a fee for managing a chronic disease or a complication from a chronic disease, and the individual having to give that money, which from directly from their bank account, to somebody else for that chronic disease. Great example. We carry our family uses a company called Crowd Health here in the United States. We do, this
Shout out
crowdfunding
to Andy
model.
Schooner.
Yeah. Andy, and it's a fantastic model. And when I heard about it, it, it immediately aligns the person's health with their piggy bank. And also at the same time provides a sort of fair, equitable way to hopefully negotiate the cost for a procedure or intervention when it's really required.
Mm.
So I have a direct incentive by not having money indirectly taken out of my paycheck to go to a Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance plan, to make sure my family stays in tip top condition, because we can then continue to put our money into whatever asset we want, some of that into Bitcoin, and have that as an emergency insurance fund for when, if a problem arises in our house in a catastrophic way. But knowing that we're trying to avoid all of the chronic disease potentials along the way, so that we can continue to keep our own money under our own control. If you don't see your money that way, and the money is siphoned, even though you voluntarily agreed to have your money go into an insurance plan from your provider, and it's siphoned off, one, it sort of happens behind the scenes, so you don't really see it. Two, when the cost actually does come up, it's also abstracted away, and all you might see is that you had to pay maybe a $30 copay at the doctor's office, but you don't realize that actually what you paid for managing your high blood pressure and your diabetes was really $750. And then for the times at which you don't use that money is essentially being given to somebody else who has incentives to have X, Y, or Z treatment available for you. So Bitcoin, if it is going to fix the healthcare system, could potentially give individuals a way to save in a sovereign fashion with the potential for appreciation, and see and care for that pot of money directly themselves, and not want to give it away for a particular intervention. And so be very thoughtful about what intervention they want. Would they go get LASIK eye surgery for the convenience of not having to wear glasses if it costs them directly, $2,500? Maybe not. But when it's only seemingly $150 because of a procedural, copay from their insurance company, it seems like the barrier to enter into that procedure is very low. When in fact, it was just high, and it was high many months and years prior to it, as a result of you continuously having a very costly or high quality insurance plan that makes it seem artificially low. So I think there's a possibility that when at least the payment for healthcare services is directly aligned with the individuals who are paying for them, the quality of care needs to be exponential. There's a fantastic hospital here not in Houston, but in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Surgical Center, which they just do cash payments for everything. And so you want you need your gallbladder out for particular reason. They say it's $1,500. We're directly in line with the customer. We will incur all costs for complications that occur. We don't need any type of regulators saying that we're going to be, penalized for a particular infection that arises, because we're going to eat the cost if we have an infection.
Mm.
So we want to make sure that our docs are top-notch docs. We want to make sure that you have a top-notch experience, because you're departing with your dollars directly to us, and we want to make sure that you have no complications, because that's going to eat into our bottom line. So we're all financially, we all have we all have the same incentives. The person paying, the person doing the procedure, and the hospital providing the facility all have the same incentive, which is an excellent result for an excellent value, because it's in a direct, peer-to-peer consumer relationship, just like, commerce has been since the dawn of time. And that direct relationship is lost. And if it's able to be brought back, it's able to be brought back because people want to save. And people want to save because they have something to save in, and they want to save themselves as well, and they can save themselves by pursuing other alternative means to healthiness that are beyond just medical interventions.
Wow, that's a really cool perspective. That actually, it's not something I had thought of. But you're right. It's like if we make the monetary pain point of treating disease invisible, then we're actually skipping through the lesson. Like we make the lesson invisible when we make um, the incentive to be healthy as being like, if it costs you a lot of money to treat a disease, the inverse of that is it's profitable to take better care of yourself because you don't have to put a bunch of money towards this treatment. And it's really cool how the disintermediation is part of the solution, right? Like just like the disintermediation with Bitcoin, where you now actually interact peer to peer in a truthful way without there being this blurriness or opaqueness to these intermediaries, where we actually don't know what's happening under the hood. It's just this magic where we have like you said, a copay, and then we get the treatment. But all the in-between stuff, all the wasted money on all the intermediaries and all the sneaky stuff that happens, so that we don't actually fully grasp the true cost of what we're doing, that removes an incentive to take better care of ourselves. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting take. I mean, it's a little bit different here in Canada, but it's actually not that different. Instead of, my way of putting it is like, it's not like you have to pay extra for health like you do in the States. It's just included in the taxes you pay, which
Yeah,
are way
it's already
more
been
than in the
paid.
States.
Everyone's paying. Yeah, everyone's paying
Yeah,
everywhere.
we're
You'll
paying
hear,
in some way.
yeah, you'll hear people who say that they love the NHS and UK. I mean, they're paying for that as well. And so
Yeah.
what appears to be an expensive cost in the United States, for some things might actually be an expensive cost. For many things, it's just that the insurance didn't want to pay for it. And if there was a direct alignment between the person and the procedure, one would probably competitively come down, like all direct consumer goods eventually come down in price, because there's a continuous competitiveness to deliver better value and better service to capture more of the market. And because that free market dynamic in healthcare is really not there can be many hidden costs, and in various different countries it's exposed in different ways, whether you have to wait a while because of a particular socialized requirement to wait for in line, or it's exposed because a thing costs in your country a really large amount of money, and people may come after you if you don't pay, with creditors. And so really, I think what it comes down to, in order to make healthcare better, you just have to make people want to save. Like, people
Yeah.
want to not spend money on healthcare because there's a way to avoid it. And if you have something that you really want to save in, well, then you have an even extra incentive to not spend money on dumb things. And for
Yes.
many things, it appears that it's not dumb because it's your life, but there are perhaps many other steps prior to that where you could have avoided spending. And that's really, it's a conscious awareness of trade-offs. And the bag of Doritos with canola oil has a trade-off, and it's hidden. And once you become very aware of the trade-offs in all aspects of your life, because you want to save things, whether you want to save your time, whether you want to save your experiences, whether you want to save your money, it's sort of this nice adage, I'm not sure who said it, but we just need to make saving great again. And you say, when you want to save things, then, and you have ways of actually saving them, truthfully, then it's also easy to take care of yourself because you are obviously in direct control of how you spend things.
Yeah. Yeah. So even to summarize that, it's like bring it back to peer to peer so that there's true free market forces available where the providers are incentivized to provide a great experience for a great result. Um, and be more competitive than if they're just charging a ton of money to an insurance provider, which actually doesn't really care about finding competitive pricing. And then, especially if you're saving money in Bitcoin, right? Like if you spend $100 on a treatment, and you know that $100 in Bitcoin could be worth an order of magnitude more eventually, you are extra incentivized to do whatever you can to take ownership for that problem so that you maybe don't require treatment, and you make it profitable to actually take care of yourself to avoid that treatment, because the extra incentive is that $100 can be worth a lot more later on because I can actually save in a tool that preserves my time. So yeah, I think it's almost like Bitcoin is like this invisible set of incentives that are kind of nudging people to change in subtle ways. And I think just the notion of like truth and integrity and free market money is going to nudge free market incentives in all realms, including health. And I think you're seeing it with people like Andy and Crowd Health sort of offering different paths where it's like, the way I understand it is like whatever you don't spend from that account essentially creates a savings account for yourself. And like you said, you're incentivized to not spend. It's good to know it's there as an insurance policy if something, unavoidable and catastrophic happens. But in the meantime, the incentive is actually to take much better care of yourself because you actually have the pain point of paying if you require treatment for something that could be preventable. So it's like this way of just subtly incentivizing people to learn how to better care for themselves and to actually acknowledge the true trade-off of, the way they're eating, the way they're sleeping, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, very fascinating. One question I like to ask, and you can, you don't have to, you can think a bit if you need to think about it, is how do you define health today? And, it's not like I'm going to hold you to this. You can change your mind tomorrow. That's all good. How do you define health in 1 to 2 sentences?
Yeah, health is having an optimal life. I think it's just in one sentence that is what health is, an
Nice.
optimal life. For many people, that optimization is different.
Yeah.
Um,
And it should
but
be.
but in my case, the way I would define my optimal life is control over time, to spend it as it as needed with family, friends, work, interesting conversations. And without that control over your time, it's very difficult to optimize for anything, including your own personal health. And so, really, it's just the optimal life is a healthy life.
Well said. I love that because optimal does leave a lot of subjectivity, which surely it should because everyone makes their own choices, wants to live a different life. And yeah, that's kind of what it's all about. Um, so you wrote a book on co-sleeping. And I guess a way to frame this is number one, I'd be really curious to know why you wrote it because writing a book is not an easy feat, especially for a busy doctor, I would imagine. But why'd you write it? And then I'd be really interested to hear your explanation of what co-sleeping is, as if a curious parent that's never heard of the term, doesn't even know what this is, comes up to you and says, Dan, I just heard the word co-sleeping. I have no idea what it is, but I'm going to be a parent in 6 months from now. And I'd really like to know what it is. So why'd you write it? And what would you tell that curious parent or parent to be that has
Yeah.
never heard of the term? Like I said before, Bitcoiners are hopeful people. It seems like a lot of Bitcoiners are making babies. And I think that comes with the hopeful part, right? If you're hopeful for a good future, there's a much larger incentive to bring new lives into the world if you have a beautiful view of what the future could be. They also often have the means to actually raise a family because they store their money or they store their time in sound money. So hopefully this is a relevant topic for Bitcoiners that are having babies, and I'm about to have a daughter, so it's certainly relevant for me. So
Congrats.
yeah, I would love to hear your
Yeah.
take on co-sleeping.
So I wrote the book because I had a problem. I had a problem because we had a daughter who did not want to sleep in another bedroom. And I think most people write books, hopefully, because they have a problem that they need to either personally solve or they have an idea that just burns inside them until it's put down on pages. I've written a couple other books for various topics in medicine, and it's just you have an idea, you have to get it out of your brain. You're not going to be rich, but you know that if it doesn't get out of your brain onto paper in an organized way, it will drive you crazy. And in this case, I had a real problem because I was taught, as most physicians are, through any type of pediatric training along the course in their medical career, that um, co-sleeping, which is the act of consciously sharing a bed with an infant or a child, distinct from bed sharing, which is the random event of a kid, coming into the bedroom in the middle of the night, or you having to bring a kid in and then just kind of randomly falling asleep and the kid just happens to be on the bed with you. That would be bed sharing. Co-sleeping is sort of a conscious, prepared decision to generally for one parent is probably the most safest, but it could be for two parents. But most traditional co-sleeping environments are a mother and an infant, to share a bed while sleeping, in a sort of a prepared way. And we had a problem where we were, my wife was breastfeeding our daughter, our first daughter, and she did not want to really be separated in the nighttime from my mom or from her mom. And so you put the kid in the other room, you're freaking out. That's one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of any parent, is to then put a child in a dark room or with a nightlight and maybe a baby monitor. Now they're video, or but traditionally they were just audio only. Some people use O2 monitors on socks to monitor saturations throughout the night. It's just a terrifying event to see essentially a helpless infant, who is helpless and dependent solely on you for survival, to be completely separated in the middle of the night. And then compound on that the fact that most infants will still want to feed, at regular 1 to 2 hour increments throughout usually 90 minutes to, 2.5 hours every all the time at night. And if you're breastfeeding, which is sort of one of the more, healthy things, when raising an infant, it becomes increasingly difficult because only one individual, the mother, can go to that room to provide the care. And so they are constantly going back and forth from room to room, or they have a crib or a bassinet in the room and they're getting to the edge of the bed, picking the kid up, getting the positional changes, turning on the light. And that becomes sometimes very challenging. And for our situation, frequently, my wife would, after, breastfeeding, would, fall asleep, as, the hormonal changes after breastfeeding cause a mother to be sleepy, just like the infant is also sleepy, to sleep in the same bed. And that became a very troubling experience for both myself and my wife, where we were, aware of the fact that sudden infant death syndrome seems to be talked about in the same realm as co-sleeping, and that there is a constant medical education that you'll get when you go to your first pediatrician's appointment, that you should be sleeping in separate beds, and that there should be nothing, in the bed with your infant, for the fear that that infant will suffocate and die. And so we are in the situation where the only way to have a calm infant and to allow breastfeeding to happen in a really organized way was for the infant to be in the bed with my mom, or with her mom, sleeping on her chest or right alongside her, sort of in the nook of the arm. And so I just started reading, seeing, is this really as dangerous as it is? And so that was sort of, in medicine, my sort of first, we've all lived through COVID and have various opinions, and understand perhaps much more of the truthfulness of what really took place. But at the point of this being, I think, the 2016, when we had our first infant, I was, fully into what was in the guidelines being truth. And so you start reading about how bad co-sleeping is, and what are some of the studies, albeit small, there are on how to sleep safely with an infant. You realize that it is not a taboo topic much around the world. And in many cultures, to not sleep with your infant is actually the more taboo practice. And then you sort of
Interesting.
look deeper and you realize the biological similarities to us and chimpanzees, and the fact that a chimp would never leave another baby infant chimp somewhere on the forest floor, and that chimp psychologically requires the feeling of the mother's fur while sleeping, and that there are very accepted and more natural ways to sleep with an infant, where naturally the infant wants to go alongside you. And it's very difficult to roll over onto an outstretched arm, which is the arm that the infant is sleeping over. So suffocation and strangulation of an infant by a human is essentially biologically impossible when the infant is sleeping next to you. You just can't anatomically roll onto that outstretched arm.
Mm.
Um, and that being anatomically close to a mother while breastfeeding essentially allows for the sleep wake REM cycle of 90 minutes to be synchronized between the mom and the infant. And that little bit of exhaled carbon dioxide from the mom onto the infant while they're sleeping in close proximity triggers breaths, which may actually be protective against sudden infant death syndrome. And that you realize breastfeeding itself is the greatest way of preventing sudden infant death syndrome. And the best way to allow for consistent long-term breastfeeding is to have proximity between mother and infant. And it just becomes this no-brainer red pill moment when you realize that everything you have been taught is one, wrong, or at least somewhat misguided, and that there is a incredibly safe way to co-sleep, and that it's been what's been practiced for most of humanity up until about the 1940s, and then more prevalently in past the 1980s, when a few popular books by some doctors were written, in a Consumer Reports advisory was released in 1995 with regards to some strangulation events. And then you just realize that that there's a lot of unanswered questions or things that are not potentially true, and you just can't help but write it down.
That was a stellar answer. Um, and yeah, what a powerful red pill moment to just um, and I think the key there is curiosity, right? It's like not taking what you've been told at face value, truth, and not questioning it. Is back to first principles and just asking why, out of curiosity. It's like I wonder why that's the case. I wonder if that's always been the case. Because certainly you would think that conventional wisdom is that humans have not slept in different rooms for since our evolution began, right? This seems like a very modern day and I dare I say Western phenomena,
Very
where if you
Western.
live in the jungle in South America, you don't have extra rooms in your place. And I remember, I think I read an interview where this researcher was actually interviewing a mother that was in the jungle. And she asked her the question, what do you do when your baby cries in the middle of the night? And the mother just kind of looked at her with a blank stare. It was like, she doesn't. She sleeps right next to me. And the researcher was just dumbfounded where, you come from this perspective where things must be this way, or this is just the way that culture is. Never questioning it, just kind of living in alignment with the environment that surrounds you and the information you're getting from the experts. And just this cognitive dissonance of being like, wow, I never even thought that that was a thing. But now that you explain it with that kind of logic and rationale and simplicity, it's like, it's crazy that we do it any other way. And I guess the question for you is why, is it just that the medical world has just so much inertia that it and momentum that it just doesn't, it's very stubborn to change? Or like what is the reason, where's the flaw that allows pediatric physicians to still be talking about co-sleeping in this way that doesn't actually reflect reality? Like why is it so? Like how can we be so far off?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It goes back to our first, at the beginning, we were talking somewhere along the line, that ability to ask why that you were really taught in medical school, which is part of the fundamental, ways that you learn cause and effect, gets lost. And it gets lost because of the one, I think it gets lost because of time. People are on sort of doctors on a rat race a little bit. There's lots of patience and time for these nuanced conversations. But it also gets lost because of sort of peer pressure, and the peer pressure to be constantly following the guideline. And the guideline is going to be the most milk toast, middle of the road, safe,
Hmm.
non-nuanced,
Conservative.
conservative recommendation. Guidelines per, there's no probably big bed sleep, lobby saying this is a bad thing, but
Right.
there are, very popular media figures who become, there's a famous Dr. Richard Ferber. He popularized this cry it out method where the infant is supposed to extinguish their emotion in the middle of the night by just crying inconsolably until they no longer want to cry anymore.
That
And that's
sounds
how you have,
insane.
and that is how you have the calm sleep night. And that, that individual, for some, for probably many sort of media, incentivized events, becomes popularized. The book becomes popularized. The talk shows and the, whether it's, an Oprah Winfrey type of, appearance, but these appearances on popular television solidify this idea. And then, just like any type of idea, once it is incepted, and if it's incorrect, it's very difficult to roll back. And then when the guideline is being written, it's being written by people who have been exposed to potentially wrong ideas, who feel uncomfortable saying, well, should we really put a nuanced recommendation in our sleeping guideline that it is okay to co-sleep as long as you're not intoxicated or drunk, and that you've practiced it in the, the historic way? Or should we just say sleep in a separate bed. And then,
Yeah.
the guy, it's just far easier to say sleep in a separate bed. It also has to do with the fact that we defer a lot of our thinking in medicine to larger organizations. And so, should there even be a recommendation for the Academy of Pediatrics on how to sleep with your baby? I mean, maybe not. I mean, maybe that is wisdom that's best shared between a mother, and her, daughter who's having her first, child. But that depends on a strong societal family unit. And so, as all these various, pieces of wisdom and knowledge that we usually rely on, family units, relative units, close social knit communities, of how to do things that historically work well, even if we don't know exactly why they work, but they do actually work, start to slowly break down. You see the replacement with sort of more less, or sorry, less um, nuanced recommendations from far removed societies that maybe not reflect the wishes and ideals of a community. And so that is probably how it happens in aggregate. But really what I think it has to do is that some of the wisdom that normally would happen in a family unit of close-knit women is perhaps lost. And it gets lost because of many reasons. The family structure might not be as high and strong in the Western world as it is, because there are interviews with Mayan women when interview the Mayan women. I talk about this in the book, and they ask them, what are your thoughts on not sleeping with their infant, and they can't even comprehend the question, because that is just essentially an insane
Yeah.
concept to them. And if you ask them of the Western woman about sleeping with her infant back in these 1970 studies, and then not sleeping with the infant is the foreign concept. And so things become totally skewed, because I think of some of the culture of wisdom gets lost.
Yeah. And it's almost like we somehow feel the sense of safety to offshore our decision making to like authorities with these blanket sort of statements, thinking that, well, they said it, so it must be, they must know more than me. I think it's the default of not trusting ourselves and maybe our intuition as much, and being just sort of ingrained to say, defer to the authority. They know better. They know best. Even if it doesn't feel right, it's like they know. But I think that's coming back. I think we're like, even with Bitcoin, like the disintermediation of money is actually leading to the disintermediation of, I think, community networks as well, where you have more people connecting. Like Bitcoiners seem to just have this surplus of time. No surprise, right? You store your time in sound money that doesn't steal from you. All of a sudden have this surplus that's not being stolen anymore, and you have time to actually go out and speak to people in your community, foster gatherings, bring people together, and you have this common ground value set that actually self-selects for people who think with similar values. And I think it's this beautiful sort of ephemeral thing where we use the same money that has this base value set that guides everything we do. Therefore, when I meet Bitcoiners in real life, I'm like, I already share a lot of things I already share a lot of similarities and alignment with this person, even though I don't even know them yet. But the fact that they use truth money, that stands for freedom, sovereignty, transparency, it automatically means something. And so I already know that they have probably a bigger tendency to not trust and actually verify, or take more responsibility in other areas of their lives, not just their money. And so I think whether it's podcasts like this or docs like yourself who are kind of asking the questions and putting books out there for, it's funny because what you do for selfish reasons to get the stuff out of your brain and onto a page can actually just, it's like what's good for you is good for the whole when you're doing it in alignment with what you're trying to accomplish, which is understand how to live a life, a natural life, and raise a healthy family. I think that's just such a powerful example of that. And
Yeah, I mean, we don't live. You often hear people say that we live in a post-truth world. I mean, the truth is, we don't live in a post-truth world. There is truth out there, and it will always be there. It's just that we live in a post-trust world in which many of the ways in which we could get truth reliably are no longer there.
yeah, well said. And maybe the more responsibility we take for understanding things, the less we actually have to trust, right? It's like this dichotomy where the less you understand something, the more you have to trust other people who claim to understand it. And you know typically, I think for a long time that actually worked pretty well, right? It allowed us to specialize in what we could understand deeply and then provide that information to each other. But it's almost like we're transitioning between worlds right now: the old world of traditional medicine and traditional finance, and then the new world of like health and money. And in the old world, it was so complex that you had to defer to the authorities who did their specialized study and then told you what to believe or what to do. And I think in this new world, stimulated by this idea that like we actually, well-intentioned people who are misguided are actually leading us to make unwise decisions. And the only antidote to that is literally take more responsibility, right? Take more responsibility for understanding money. That way you don't have to trust and listen to the advice of this complex finance machine. You can just save and sound money. And then with health, it's like the medical experts that are there in acute situations are still, I'm very glad they're there. But the more I understand health, the less I have to trust other people to tell me what to do to take care of myself. And the more I can sort of understand and learn and do experiments myself to see what actually feels good for me. Right? It's all nice to see this big study that said you should eat this certain thing, but at the end of the day, what feels good to me when I eat something is actually much more powerful and much more important than whatever this study says. And I think as a society, we seem to be sort of slowly learning that. Um, and yeah, it's kind of nice to see this renaissance of personal responsibility, starting with money, trickling into health, trickling to all areas of life, really. You have any other books that you're going to be writing?
No. During COVID, I had written a fictional book of some life values that I sort of held dear. It's told, between it's called The Simple World, and it's as during COVID, I was just I was going insane, as many of us did, and you know sleepless nights and sort of worrying about the world in terms of freedoms and liberties and my children's future and all the various things that come along with it, in addition to many stresses in the healthcare system that are beyond the scope of this talk, but the that have to do with various pieces of liberty and freedom. But yeah, so I wrote this small little book of just a few page chapter ideas. That's a conversation between two friends that are neighbors, one of which is an older man and one of is a younger individual, and they just talk through various things such as how do you identify what is the most ideal way to live a life, how do you know what is the way of how do you know what you should do, how do you know how to align your family. And they have their book, they have this conversation throughout the chapters about various pieces of just what it is to live a good life. I had studied philosophy. I was an undergraduate as well, and so that sort of those sort of concepts of what is a good life really have always resonated with me since I was in college, and how do you give that to your kid and sort of show them that this is what you felt was important for being a good person, is I think one of the things that many of us probably will struggle with as we get older. But for some reason at that point during COVID, I was struggling with it, as a younger individual. And I'm sort of a firm believer that if you could write a journal with the intent that that journal was read by all of your kids and are published just privately, it would dramatically change your awareness of how you lived your life. If you had to write down your thoughts and knew that those thoughts would be read later, would be incredible. Many of us think about how we could pass on different ideas to our kids, and none of us probably do it in a great way. But I felt at that point in my life, I wanted to do something creative to at least have something on paper that one day my kids could read and knew that it embodied me, as sort of the way that I felt a good person should live in the world, and some of the challenges that they may encounter when they're growing up. And I just want to do that not in a sort of a preachy way, but in a nice way, as a fictional conversation of two individuals talking throughout a couple of chapters of a book. And so I wrote this book called The Simple World, and I with the intent that yes, you can buy it, but really it's on my bookshelf and it's available for someday, when I'm dead, my kids look back and say, hey, my dad wrote this in 2019 and or 2020, when I had finished it. And I really understand him as a person. And so that's sort of the only other book that I've written beyond some educational text for emergency medicine providers. And I just probably leave your audience with at least what that idea that how can you write for your future children to learn about you. Or many of us probably do this in podcasting. Many of the podcasters, I think, have immortalized their ideas in ways that their kids can someday listen to them if they're interested. And that's also incredibly powerful. because at some point, our life is, we know this, our life is finite, but these ideas are infinite. And if we can pass them on, just like the spoken word of the Aboriginal tribes, or as the historic writings of the monks, those words are timeless.
Dan, you're a very unique human. And what I mean, what a gift to write, not just like, again, writing something selfishly to give to your children to make sure that they understand the wisdom that you had and make sure that that doesn't go by the wayside, um, has this giant benefit. Like I'm gonna get your co-sleeping book, and that I saw you had written that too on your website. So I'm gonna grab those two because I what a time to need a book like that, right? Like when it seems like so many people are just sort of a little bit lost. And I think we are often most lost before we are most clear on finding our way. And I think, this notion that through times of pain often emerges beauty, right? Like you see some of some of the most beautiful art that humans have ever created
Yeah.
were actually stemmed out of massive pain in their personal lives. And so I think this period of, you know, transition, let's call it, this COVID period, I think created a lot of pain for a lot of people, but also out of that stemmed probably a lot of clarity and a lot of beauty in terms of the art or the content or the things that were created. So thank you for doing all the writing you do. Thank you for putting those books into the world and being a force for truth. Thank you for taking the time to chat on the podcast today. I'm going to chat with John in our next health hang. If you're free and available and you want to join in on that conversation, we're looking to build kind of a bigger panel of people who enjoy having deep conversations about health and are actually familiar with the world of health globally, and just, yeah, riff on the concept of health in all of its unique little facets from through the lens of a Bitcoiner, through the lens of people who search for truth and value freedom and sovereignty and self mastery and personal responsibility. So it sounds like that's in your wheelhouse. And before we end off, if anyone wants to find your work online, how do they find you on the internet?
Um, well, I guess you could just, my website is my name. It's daniel.ostermayer.co. I've got academic work there. I'm also, I'm really not active on social media, but I do have a Twitter account that, occasionally I'll post to. It's just the spelling of my last name, Ostermayer. And, reach out. I love having conversations like this, Nick. This was really fun.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, again, if you listen to these podcasts on Fountain, you can get paid Bitcoin, small units of Bitcoin called sats for doing so. And you can also send sats to the show to support the podcast if you enjoy the content. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention. Thanks again, Dan, for being here. And ciao for now, folks.